My name's David. There's enough people in the room that there's a chance some of you don't know that, which is exciting. It's good to see lots of people. We have lots of new kids downstairs. Why I would know that is because downstairs is where we put the youth, and I'm the youth pastor. So again, if you don't know why I know where the kids are, that's the reason. And normally with like the kids, we make them answer these fun, like icebreaker type questions. So what we're going to do this morning, not really, I'm not going to make you do that. No, I'm going to tell you a story. I am in what we call here at Watershed a block. And a block it's like a small group. It's our name for small groups at Watershed, which I guess is our name for this community church thing that we do here. And so I'm in a block with a number of other people. And here's a story that I hear frequently in my block. My parents, I'm not talking about my parents, I'm talking about the parents of the people in the block who are telling the story, if that wasn't clear. My parents were really excited that I was going to this new church. I told them about it, gave them the website, and immediately I'm sitting here thinking like that was a mistake. Because that's like week one, and then the next week they come back and they're like, yeah, my parents watched a message. They have some concerns. And then, kind of we chuckle about it and, we make fun of the life we used to have. And we move on. I say all that because if that's you, if that story sounds familiar and maybe you have friends or family who are praying for you because of the fact that you're here this morning, don't show them this one. Don't show them this one. Just a hunch. Just a hunch. And maybe not, well, I don't know. I go back and forth. I wasn't sure what the punchline of that story was going to be because I go back and forth. Because one of the things we get accused of here is, they don't take the Bible seriously. And this whole series, Textuality, it's kind of a fun play on grammar there, Textuality. This whole series is actually us taking the Bible very, very seriously, or at least in my opinion. Take it or leave it. But so on the one hand, maybe this is the one to show them. I don't know. I'll let you decide. It's your Thanksgiving dinner, after all. So, took you a second, but then everyone got there. Because what we're going to be doing is we are going to be exploring the Bible, the pages of Scripture. And here's the hunch we have. At least one of two things is probably true for you, if not both. Either one, the Bible at some point in your life, it was everything. There's a mediocre Christian pop song from the 90s called Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. It's a banger by the band Burlap to Cashmere. Probably never heard of them. I saw them in concert. They were the headliner. So, but you get basic, B-I-B-L-E, see it spells Bible, it's clever. Either that was it for you growing up. It was this thing that it was the roadmap to life, mostly to life after death. But it was the thing that you adhered to, that you followed. And now maybe, again, just a hunch. Now maybe you're here. You stumbled into this place because it doesn't work that way anymore. And you're like, okay, what do I do with this thing? There's this mix of maybe nostalgia and some positive experiences, and I just don't know what to do with it anymore. And the temptation is to just kind of throw it out entirely, which is what your friends and family are just waiting for you to do. Or maybe, because it could be both, or it was the source of trauma. It was lorded over you in a way that made you feel less than, that made you feel as if who you are at the innermost parts of your being were somehow an affront to God. And so it's impossible for you, if you are to experience the Bible at all, and you're forgiven if you choose not to, but it's impossible for you to approach the Bible in any way but perhaps as a means of understanding it in a liberating way. And that's assuming that you're interested in engaging it at all. So if one or both of those stories resonates with you even vaguely, then this is the series for you. This is who we had in mind when we crafted this. I actually have a Bible up here on stage. I don't think that's ever happened to me before. Again, like I said, don't show this to your friends and family. But no, this book, or collection of books, this library, if you will, it carries a lot of baggage. And I cannot promise you that this series is going to resolve that baggage, but I don't know. Maybe it'll help sort it out in a meaningful way. And so to do that, I am going to do this thing. I kind of joke, and I don't flatter myself to think that all of you are like paying attention every time David preaches and are like keeping track of what I talk about. But I have one sermon, and I just recycle it over and over and over again. And now that I've kind of given that away, you'll probably notice, and I'll be useless here. But I'm going to just kind of give you the same sermon again, and which is great for those of you who have never heard it before, hopefully. But I realized that the sermon I wanted to preach this morning, or message, I don't know what we call it here, I kind of gave something similar like 3 months ago. So one, that's probably long enough that we can run it back. But two, I wanted to come up with a different angle this morning to kind of introduce the idea. And of course, as you saw in the spoiler video, that idea, of course, is this idea of sin, namely original sin. Now, if you're not familiar with what we mean by original sin, it's this idea. And honestly, if you're not familiar with it, good on you. Like, you probably avoided some of the trauma I was referring to earlier. But at least normally in kind of Christian circles, this idea of original sin is that a long time ago, there was this dude and this chick, Adam and Eve, and they ate an apple, and now you suck. Like, that's it. That's the basic idea, is they had a weird run-in with a snake, and because of like a uniquely, confusingly bad decision in that moment, now you are born and God hates you. Like, that's it. If you've never been to church before, you're like, really? Like, that's what? Yeah, no, that's it. That's what original sin means. And so, in a place like Watershed, the move that we often make, one of the first moves is to kind of like chuck that and be like, that is a bad idea. You are beautifully and wonderfully made. Literally the imprint, the image of the divine is in you. And let's just put this original sin idea in the rearview mirror and move on to bigger and better things. And that's a totally fine move. I've made it many times in my life. But what I want to do this morning is a little more audacious. I want to reclaim or sort of reimagine or redeem this idea of original sin, which is not a very progressive move, but I'm going to try to do it. And what I want to do is I want to use the verse, the passage, which I think is kind of like the go-to verse about this. It's in the book of 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul is writing this. If you don't know who Paul is, don't worry about it. Not super important. And he's talking about resurrection. He's talking about this idea of salvation, which would be fun to get into, but we don't have time. But he says this. It'll be on the screen there. He says, "For as in Adam," the guy I was talking about a few minutes ago, "for as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive." This historically is the verse. This dude named Augustine, he was kind of a hedonist, kind of living life to the fullest, and then he discovered God, and then decided that his whole old life was terrible, and so he found this verse, and he's the kind of guy who invented original sin, and he was like 400 years after the Bible was written. It's a whole thing, but he also couldn't read Greek, which is why he got this so badly. Just kind of a fun fact for those of you taking notes. But the whole idea here is that all of us as the ancestors, I guess, of that Adam guy, inherit, I don't know, biologically or just kind of some weird way, inherit his sinfulness. And then something happens transactionally when Jesus is crucified that somehow fixes that. And it gets really messy and bloody and borderline abusive. And so yeah, I understand the temptation to just kind of chuck all that and kind of say, yeah, Paul was wrong, or maybe we just kind of misunderstood that. But I actually think there's something here. And to really unpack it, I do want to go back to the story where all of this supposedly happened in the book of Genesis. So this is Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says this: "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman," that's Eve, Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" Spoiler alert, God had indeed said that. And then he goes on, he says, "You will not certainly die," the serpent said, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And that knowing good and evil part, that's the part where, like I said, I have one sermon, so that's the thing you'll have heard before. I'll get to that in a second. And then it goes on. It says, "When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom," bonus, "she took some of it and ate it. She also gave some of it to her husband, Adam, who was with her, and he ate it. And then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked." It's a key detail, don't lose that. "And so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." Okay, so what's going on here? A couple things. First off, and this is another part not to show your friends and family, I don't think this actually happened. I don't think this is history. And maybe this is the first time you've heard that said in church. Welcome. But yeah, I don't think that this is a record of the original two people in history, and if that disrupts you or confuses you, then I'm happy to buy you coffee and explain why I think that and stuff like that. It's an excuse to use my church credit card to buy coffee. And but just because it's not history doesn't mean that there's not truth here. This guy Marcus Borg, theologian, 20th century, he died recently. He says, I'm going to butcher his quote here, but he says something to the effect of, all of the Bible is true, and some of it happened. And I think there's something really liberating about that. And so there is some truth here that I think we can glean about the human experience, even if this is not actually why all the bad things in the world happen. Okay, so I just wanted to say that up front. So what's going on here? So first I want to point out some things that we gloss over as we're typically reading this. The first is that this whole idea that Adam and Eve, the man and the woman in the garden, the whole idea that they're able to even hear what the snake is saying. Okay, not just that they're able to hear it, because that's weird, but that they're able to respond to the snake's temptation suggests that maybe we're approaching this story with some bad presuppositions. Because what most of us, if you're like me, most of us were raised with is that Adam and Eve were perfect. They were sinless, they were flawless, they were perfect. And in this moment of hungry, I guess, weakness, they ate the fruit. It never actually says it's an apple. That's just kind of how we render it in our flannel graphs in Sunday school. And they ate this fruit, and now every bad thing that's ever happened happens. But think about it. The idea that they were able to conceive of something greater than themselves, something more transcendent, something more infinite, suggests that there was already this qualitative gap. There was already some lack, some longing within them that made them feel as if there could be more out there. The fact that they were able to succumb to temptation, I think, is the crucial detail here, and I actually think it's the good news of the story, and we'll get back to that in a second. But how then, the next thing I want you to notice, how then do they go about trying to solve this lack, trying to, as the serpent says, be like God? Well, they eat the fruit, yeah. And we get fixated on the fruit, we get fixated on the disobedience, and we miss the whole reason for the prohibition to begin with, which is you'll be like God because you'll know good and evil. And this is the key thing, like I said, this is the key thing. Because think about it. In your own life, this is true of me as well, but in your own life, if you know what's good or evil, logic dictates, Instagram usually dictates, you pursue the good, and you run from the evil, and we sometimes have other words for that. You pursue the healthy, you run from the unhealthy. You pursue the familiar, you run from the unfamiliar, the pure and the impure, the clean, the dirty. We create these binaries. And if you think about how all human suffering works, it's usually the product of us thinking we know for certain what is good and what is evil, what should be in and what should be out, what is pure versus what is impure. And then we assign those categories either to ourselves and or others. Trauma ensues. So for example, maybe you look out in the world and you see, okay, I know what the good life is. I know what the good relationship is. I know what the good body is. I know what the good lifestyle is. And then you look around and you identify the evil. Usually first in yourself. Usually you're like, okay, if that's the good and I do not match that, then I need to pursue that at all costs. And then I'll be good. I'll be, maybe as they say, like God. I will find wholeness and salvation and fulfillment. And, or, sometimes more often, we look around and we see who is different than our ideal of the good. And we think, okay, I need less of them in the world, less of them in my life. Or more often, perhaps we see them, the other, could be the racialized other, could be the differently sexed or gendered other, could be the different faithed other. Fill in the blank. We're really good at coming up with othering categories. But you see the other as the obstacle, the impetus, well, actually it's the obstacle and the impetus of whatever it is you desire, whatever you've identified as the good. So at the risk of losing you all here, because this gets kind of complex. So think about it. So Adam and Eve are fine, but they're finite. The very fact that they were able to be tempted by the serpent suggests that they're not these like perfect Greek god Adonis figures that we often paint them as for children. They're human. They're human. And the serpent promises them a kind of transcendence, but the cost of that transcendence is this confidence that they can know good and evil for certain. And that is a costly exchange. Because again, with all the examples I just gave, if you know for certain what is good and what is not, then you can kind of justify anything to pursue the good. You very quickly get into an ends justifies the means sort of scenario, and scapegoating ensues. Scapegoating, and by that I mean sacrificing something or someone, usually yourself, often others, in the pursuit of this thing that you think is going to save you, this thing that you think is going to make you whole, this thing that you think is going to make you like God, or whatever you mean by God, whatever you think God wants of you. And that exchange, that lie, that deception, to me is much more important for us to kind of meditate on, reflect on, than the fact that they disobeyed and ate the apple. So going back to 1 Corinthians, what do I think is going on here? So in Adam all die. All I think this means is that when we live our lives according to the logic that Adam and Eve bought into, then yeah, death ensues. So if our notion of wholeness, if our notion of salvation, if our notion of freedom is this idea that I just need to pursue the good at all costs, come what may, no matter the sacrifice, which is basically the lie that our whole modern world, especially in this country, is built upon, then yeah, the body count, literally or metaphorically, is going to be high. So what does Christ do? So if in the logic of Adam all die, then what's the logic of Christ? It's not, let me be super clear, it's not this idea that Christ comes in and that, this lack that we feel that I was referring to earlier. It's not that that's some sort of like debt that we owe God. And then Jesus comes in with, I guess, like really, really valuable blood or whatever and dies and satiates God's need to be some sort of cosmic debt collector. Not that. So if you get nothing else out of this morning of all my rambling, take that away. Not that. But what I do think could be going on here is something a little different. If Jesus, according to the Bible at least, remember we love the Bible here, if Jesus is God's self-description of God's self, Jesus is how God describes God's self. That's at least what the Bible claims. And Jesus is human, just like us. Jesus experiences that lack that I've been talking about. Jesus experiences that finitude, that finiteness, that need to strive for transcendence. Another part of the Bible says God has placed eternity in the heart of humanity. That longing to transcend, to connect with the infinite or the absolute. Jesus experienced that. The Bible tells us that Jesus experienced everything that we experience. Also tells us that Jesus died and experienced a moment of God-forsakenness. So if all of that very human Jesus is God's self-description of God's self, then the logic of Christ per 1 Corinthians 15 is that this original lack, this finitude, this mere humanity that all of us experience is in fact okay. And that is the good news of original sin. The fact that all of us, and I mean all of us, are born with that same lack, that same finitude, that same longing for transcendence is actually the thing that unites us. And it is our attempts to fill that, to fill that void with things, with people, with relationships, with wealth, with experiences. It's our conviction that these things that we try to transcend that lack with, it's that conviction that's going to save us. That's what leads to what we normally think of as sin. Any of you don't have to actually answer, this is a rhetorical question, but for those of you, especially maybe who are maybe raised in the Catholic Church, you're probably familiar with the 7 deadly sins, right? They talked about it in the Shazam movie. It was a little different than the Catholic Church probably, but the whole idea, you have lust, greed, pride, envy. That's 4, there's 3 others. But if you think about the way that these sins are articulated, these are the things, these are the manifestations of our attempts to save ourselves, our attempts to fill that void that we experience to our detriment and almost always to the detriment of others. And this scales, everyone. This isn't just an interpersonal thing. This scales to the systemic level. It scales to the societal level, to the national level, to the global level. These attempts that we make to save ourselves, to know good and evil for sure, eliminate the evil, and thus be like God, this is at the source of the trauma and the abuse and the marginalization, the exploitation that we inflict on ourselves and others. And so the logic of Christ, crucially, is not to come in and fill that or give us an escape from it. God in Christ identifies with it. Says, if you want to know what God is like, if you want to know what the absolute is like, if you want to know what I am like, look at Christ. And really what all that is permission to look at you, yourself, and the strange other in your midst. I'm not going to do that cheesy thing where I'm look at the person to your left and to your right and say, I see God in you. I mean, you can do it if you want now that I've kind of ripped the Band-Aid off, but no, I'm not going to ask you to do that. But really, that's the idea here. That's the idea here, is that the good news of original sin, or at least what I think Paul and his cohorts were getting at with original sin, is that it is all of us. We're all in this together. But the lack that I'm describing, it's not bad. It just means you're human. And according to the Bible, by way of Christ, it just means you're like God. Did you, anyone familiar with the Donut Repair Club? Ooh, yeah. So just me in that weird corner of mid-90s evangelicalism. All right, well, let me describe this for you. So the Donut Repair Club, it was this middle-aged guy and a bunch of kids, so we're off to a great start. And they sing these cheesy songs, kind of like Barney, but maybe with some Dunkin' Donuts themed product placement. And so they would have these basic trivial moral dilemmas. And then the donut repair guy would come out of nowhere with some trite solutions, and he'd bring with him his friend Duncan, who was like a Jim Henson style like donut puppet, and then they would sing some more songs, and everyone would go home happy and satisfied. But the big theme, kind of the big idea here was that like the donut is like the perfect picture of what we're talking about. There is this God-shaped hole in the center of your life, this void, and nothing can fill it but Jesus. And then when you fill it, like I think you can see where the image is going. Like the donut hole gets filled, and then you have but you get it. But I was telling a friend, I actually really like this idea of the God-shaped hole. But here's how I want to twist it. In the same way that we're kind of reclaiming original sin, saying that it's actually the thing that unites us, and if we can kind of make peace with that, if we can make peace with our mere humanity, then we will stop hurting ourselves and hurting each other, what we actually mean by sin, in order to save ourselves and achieve this transcendence that God has told us is already given to us in our humanness. So if we're reclaiming that, then maybe the way that we reclaim this idea of a God-shaped hole is that not that the hole is shaped like God, and so God can then come in and perfectly fill it, but the hole is shaped like God because it is literally the image of God in you. That lack, that cut, that longing for something beyond yourself, outside of yourself, that is the infinite within you bursting forth. And so when you look at the strange other who is maybe racialized differently than you, sexed differently than you, gendered differently than you, rather than seeing that as a threat to the purity of your being, it's perhaps an opportunity to see them as evidence of the infinite bursting forth in new and exciting ways. And again, that God-shaped hole is not something to be ashamed of, not something to cover over, not something to cling desperately to, well, really whatever it is. I mean, honestly, if I'm being honest, you could tell me your Enneagram number and I'll tell you what your attempt to save yourself typically looks like. It's the gift of the Enneagram. For those unfamiliar, just stay like 2 more weeks, you'll get it. But does that make sense? That the gift of original sin, again, is the thing that unites us, because in bringing us face to face with our mere humanity, the logic of Christ dictates, per 1 Corinthians, the logic of Christ dictates that it brings us face to face with God, with the divine, or perhaps another way of saying it, this is the part not to show your friends and family, with our own divinity. Kind of scandalous. Now to bring it all the way kind of back around to the Bible, and if it wasn't clear, band, that's your cue. I was raised with a notion of this document, this book, that said that this thing is perfect. In fact, there's kind of an annoying guy that I hate follow on Twitter. He literally, I'm not going to name his name because I don't want to give him that kind of press, but he comes from the part of the Christian tradition that I grew up in. And he had some kind of, hand-wringing tweet this morning. If you're not on Twitter, that's just what they call posts on the platform. Anyway, he had this tweet this morning basically saying, the Bible is perfect and, there's no need to adjust it or anything like that. And that's the idea. This, maybe you're familiar with the term inerrancy. That's what I grew up with. And it never really made sense because have you read this thing? It's a mess. It is a complete, all the words coming to my mind involve curse words. And I promised I wouldn't say those. It's a mess. We'll leave it at that. And so there was this massive disconnect for me growing up. This disconnect that said, all right, if this is perfect and that's what perfect looked like, then I don't know what to do with this. But then I abandoned that idea. And I began to really think deeply about kind of what I've been talking about this morning. This idea that maybe it's not in this transcendence from our lack, from our finitude, from our humanity, not in this stark separation between the things that we think are good and the things that we think are evil, between the things that we think are pure and the things that we think are impure. But maybe it's in the messiness, in the mud, in the muck, in the imperfection of it all. Maybe that is indeed where God bursts forth. Maybe that is the image of the invisible God in us. And if that's true of us, maybe it's true of this as well. And maybe it's precisely in the messiness of it, the occasional wrongness of it, the jagged edges and contradictions, because yes, it has them, the historical inaccuracies, the instances where we can't help but wonder, wow, like, what was the author feeling in that moment? This is coated with pain, with trauma, but also with joy, with lament and with hope. There's a real humanity to it. And when I began to meditate on that, for the first time in my life, and I'm kind of one of those womb to tomb Christians. For the first time in my life, the Bible began to live. The Bible began to reflect the image of God, not only out there, but in me and in you. That's what this series is about. So I don't care if, at the end of the day, if I convinced you that original sin is worth reclaiming. If you still kind of want to punt that, more power to you. But what I do hope you see is this idea that it is actually in the finite, actually in the lack, actually in the longing, in the cut, that God bursts forth. And if we can make peace with that in ourselves and in others, then all of the ways that we buffer ourselves against one another, all the ways that we scapegoat and trample over another in our desperate pursuit of wholeness, well, we'll be free of that. I think it's already on the screen. Now, I want to leave you with this quote from Catherine Keller. Crucial clarification, not the Catherine Keller married to Tim Keller. Very different approaches to God. This is cool, watershedy, radical Catherine Keller. It says this: with one last gasp of theological authority, let me therefore say unto you, that for which God is a nickname cares not whether you believe in God. Doesn't give a damn, isn't in the damning business. What matters, what might matter endlessly, is that we earth dwellers now together embody not what we say about God, but how we do God. The serpent was wrong, and therefore so were Adam and Eve. We don't do God by partitioning out the good and the evil and trampling over the evil. We do God by embodying, living out, embracing our mere humanity, and then embracing it in one another. And that's it. That's all I've got for you. Grace and peace. Welcome for those of you who are new. And I'll turn things back over to the band.